Thank you for joining us on the Ultimate Leadership Podcast. And here's your host, Chris Cebollero.
I got to tell you, it's another great day out there. Anytime we can bring you the Ultimate Leadership Podcast, you know that it's a great day, and hopefully your summer is kicking off and you're getting ready to have an enjoyable one. Something that could be maybe under a palm tree with a drink with an umbrella in it. Doesn't mean it has to be an adult beverage. It could be water. Put that umbrella in it and just enjoy that palm tree. I'm your host, Chris Cebollero, and today I am really excited to bring back one of my favorite guests, Dr. Chad Weinstein. And if you haven't heard, Chad and I have been talking over the past few shows, four now, this is going to be the fifth one in the series, about the virtues of leading with ethical leadership. And he has this ethical leadership framework that allows us to kind of use as a blueprint to kind of keep ourselves on the task of becoming an ethical leader. But I don't want to go ahead and take that thunder away from him. Here he is, my friend, all the way from the great state of Minnesota, Dr. Chad Weinstein. Chad, how you doing?
Chris, I am great. Thank you for having me back. It feels like it's been too long.
I got to tell you, man, I was getting a little bit upset. I, had a little tear was welling up, but I'm glad you're here now, and I know that we're going to be the better for it. And as we discuss this fifth segment in your ethical leadership virtues framework, and I'm happy to talk about the fifth edition, and that's going to be service. But before we get into service, Chad, for those who may not have picked up the first four episodes, maybe you just give them a little bit about what the first four were.
Absolutely. We're talking today about one quality that makes us more effective as ethical leaders: service. That quality, we'll call it a virtue, works with the framework of others. There are five in all: courage, competence, creativity, clarity, and service. And yes, I know they're all C's except for one, but it seemed more important to use the right terms than to get cute with the branding. So these qualities are qualities that we can cultivate in ourselves, build them like muscles, which in turn make us more effective at bringing out the best in others. If we are in fact courageous, we are willing to do what it takes, even though we're scared, even though it's difficult. When we are clear, we understand where we're going, we have a vision, we have a sense of what we're seeing and what it means. We use data effectively when we're using clarity. When we are creative, we're committed to making things better when that's the right thing to do. And service is really no different from that. Service is the commitment and the ability to do something for someone other than ourselves. Service is the capacity and commitment to other-directed action. So it's but one of the qualities that we cultivate to become more effective as ethical leaders over time.
And I think that one of the things that we have to think about is, regardless of if we're talking about emotional intelligence, if we're talking about communication skills, if we're talking about ethical leadership, service really has to be the foundation of what it is we're doing as leaders. So I know you kind of touched on it a little bit, Chad, but maybe you could give us a little bit more about service in a nutshell. If you're going to kind of break service down, are there components to service, or how do we know that we set off on the right path, that we're maybe those who are able to give service when it comes to leadership?
Absolutely. Well, yes, service does have components. All of the virtues kind of break down to make them easier to observe, because let's face it, when you say the willingness and ability to do something for other people, that's pretty broad. But one of the ways to look at that would be to think about, first of all, the quality of altruism. Is it important to you to give to others? Is it important to you to spend some of your energy, some of your time, some of your resources on things that don't directly benefit you, but that actually make the world a little bit of a better place? Ethical leaders have a component of altruism. We're also interested for ourselves, but beyond that, we are interested in giving to others. Service also includes the capacity of empathy. It's important as we're being of service to be able to put yourself in other people's shoes, to put yourself in and understand other people's perspectives. And third, service includes the quality of justice. People who are committed to service are also committed in part to making sure that people's rights are protected, to making sure that human beings are treated with the respect that all human beings are due. And on that note, my dad taught me a lesson years ago. He said, look, respect is fundamental. respect is what you accord other human beings. Never confuse respect with affection or admiration. You get to choose who you like, you get to choose who you admire, but you don't get to choose who you respect. And I think when people say, you earn my respect, I think what they really mean is, you earn my admiration. And I don't want to quibble with the words, but I want to point out here that the virtue of service hinges in part on a fundamental recognition that all human beings have value as human beings. And that's part of that justice feature of service. So service is altruism, service is empathy, and service is justice.
Yeah, I got to tell you, I mean, when you think about all those and you think about those components, certainly I wouldn't have put justice in there. But as you went ahead and kind of defined that for us, it seemed that that's exactly the place where it needs to go. Well, I guess my next question, Chad, has to fit in with this. So how does service fit into all the other virtues in this framework then?
Well, as you know, they're all interrelated. In fact, if you're only operating from one virtue, you really got to think critically. Maybe something's wrong. For example, if I'm only being courageous but not being competent, maybe I'm about to do something really stupid. And service is no different than that. Service is the motive and the capacity to act from that motive, but it fits in with acting with our competencies, acting clearly, acting creatively when appropriately, acting courageously when necessary. So service mixes with all of the other virtues to guide what we're doing.
You know, and going back to, as you were just talking about that, my mind really popped back into that justice. And when we think about justice, how does that specifically maybe correlate with courage? How does that kind of go together?
I think they go together like hand in glove. One of the reasons that injustice exists in the world is because there is a lack of courage to stop it. And when we understand what is right, what is fair, what is just, what respects people and their rights as individuals, it may be very difficult to act in accordance with that awareness. And that's where courage comes in. So we can be committed to justice all day long in our armchairs, but unless we have the courage to get out of that chair and go do what's right, our motives are for naught.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Well, some of the things that we've talked about on this show, Chad, is that, I know that you've said that virtues tend to have moderate points between extremes. So what would the extreme of service look like?
Yes, and this is a very Greek idea. The construct of virtues as I've adapted them originated with Aristotle and some of his teachers, including Plato. The Greeks very strongly believed in the doctrine of the mean, that what was right was in between extremes. And you'd say with service, how could you have too much of it? But in fact, I think you can. I think one way you can have too much service is if you are acting from service to the point where you deplete yourself. You have, in essence, demonstrated an excess of the virtue of service. It becomes unsustainable. It becomes self-defeating. The other way we can look at these excesses is we can be so motivated by service that we forget some of the other virtues that need to come along. We can forget, for example, out of a desire to be helpful, we can venture into an area where we're not competent instead of waiting to find someone who is. Or we can be so committed to resolving an injustice that we can fail to pause to observe the situation. Maybe things aren't as they seem. This happened to one of my kids on the playground. He went in and broke up a fight, and he was all charged in because he thought someone was getting beaten up. And there were two kids who were just totally playing, and they were like, "Who are you? What are you doing? We're having fun." Now, his motives were good, right? But he went in with courage, and he went in trying to stop a kid from getting beaten up, which is a absolutely service-oriented thing to do. He lacked clarity. He didn't observe the situation for what it was. So that's another way that we can be excessively service-oriented. We can be so committed that we don't pause to do the other things that are necessary to take the right actions.
Yeah, and that was kind of leading me into my next question about can someone be too service-oriented? But maybe I switched this question a little bit for you, Chad, to think about, you and I have talked a lot about servant leadership and really kind of outlining our, I guess, charge as leaders to serve. But when we think about, the virtue framework here, can someone be too service oriented?
Only if it isn't sustainable or if it reflects a lack of some other perspective that's necessary. I think that most of the leaders I work with, it is not a problem that they are too service oriented. But I can think of a couple of executives that I've coached that became so concerned with developing their people that they lost sight of the bottom line entirely. And another that literally worked herself into the hospital. She was in the hospital. There were other diagnoses, but the bottom line was it was exhaustion. And so in those instances, I think that the service virtue got out of whack. I think it was excessive in those instances. For most of us, it's the opposite. For most of us, it's remembering to give to others. It's reinforcing our commitment to be more service oriented. But for some people, it really is about, throttling that back a little bit.
Yeah, I think that really makes good sense. So, as we move forward now, and you also say that the virtues include both a will and a skill, desire and ability. Isn't this virtue all about will or desire?
It is largely about will and desire. You're right. I believe strongly that all of the virtues include both will and skill. And in this instance, there's more will than skill. But let's just look at this a little more closely, because the fact is there are some people who are well-intentioned and ineffective at being of service. Some people, for example, can't listen. And so they go off trying to do what they think is right for people instead of hearing what those people want or need. This can happen with individuals. It can also happen with international organizations. I worked with a group some years ago that was very committed to improving access to drinking water and sanitation in the developing world. And some of their first efforts demonstrated entirely the will of service, and yet they were abject failures, in part because this group went in with their engineers and their hydrologists and their geologists and their construction crews, and they built the best wells in the best places with respect to pulling water. But they didn't talk to the community and find out how those communities use those wells and how the well fits into daily life. And so the wells went unused. The people continued to use their dirty, old, ineffective wells because those were the wells that fit into the way the community worked. It wasn't a lack of will, but it was a lack of skill. We'd also look at this as maybe a lack of empathy that caused this group to fail. So you can see in service, yes, it is primarily about wanting to be of service, the desire and commitment, but you also have to be good at it to some degree.
And I think that brings up a really great point and something that we really have to be cognizant of. So now as you think about these skills of service, what skills or even more the abilities are involved in being of service?
Well, we've touched on some of them. First of all, we have to know ourselves. We have to know what we bring to the party. We have to know our strengths and our shortcomings. Second, we really have to understand the people that we're working with. We also need to invoke that virtue of clarity to have a vision for what we're doing and why we're doing it. And we may need some of that fortitude from courage to push through even when it gets hard. So the ability part of service also meshes well with those other virtues.
So then now, we're thinking about service, and now really as we start to get to the end of this virtues framework, we're really trying to put this all into, I guess, one blueprint. But what are the challenges to exhibiting or maybe even growing the virtue of service? I mean, what gets in people's way?
Well, some of these are obvious. Sometimes we just get a little selfish. And that's easy to say as a criticism, but let me put it this way. Sometimes we don't feel like we have enough to share. Sometimes we feel like we don't have enough resources to meet our own needs. Sometimes we feel that we don't have enough of our own time in order to give of our time to others. So we can say selfish, but another way to look at that is a perception of scarcity on our part can be a real barrier to being of service to others.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a really great point, and you've got to be able to recognize that in yourself before you get too far down that ladder. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, not at all. I want this to be a conversation. I think I might have had a little too much coffee today, so I'm talking a little fast. Another barrier or challenge for the virtue of service is our lack of connection to other people. Individually, it is easier to be of service to someone we know than to be of service to someone we don't know. And in fact, it can be very difficult to reach across differences, distances, cultures, communities to really be of service to others. So this is also a real challenge for us. And it becomes a greater challenge because, let's face it, as a society, we don't join groups like we used to. We see this in the volunteer fire service. We see this in churches and synagogues and mosques and communities of faith. And we see it in civic organizations. I spoke to a Rotary Club yesterday at lunch. We had a great conversation. This is a completely service-oriented organization. And the one thing they want for is more members. They want more people to join them in doing good. And you know what? People as a society aren't joining like they used to. And that is a huge barrier to expressing the virtue of service. If we're not connected to groups that are doing that, if we're not connected in communities, it's real hard to do more than accidental or incidental acts of good for others.
Yeah, and I guess that really kind of brings me to a last question then. And I think you hit it right on the head. How can we as leaders create those cultures that we can cultivate that virtue of service, whether it's in an organization, whether it's in a department, whether it's in a social organization, the Rotary Club? I mean, how can we cultivate that relationship?
Well, I think let's you and I put our heads together on that. One thing I think of is maintaining and reinforcing a sense of purpose, helping people understand that part of the reason we're together is to serve others and to celebrate that and to tell stories about that and to remind people of that purpose on a very regular basis. Do you have any thoughts as well? I have some more.
You know, I think one of the things that for me, it really comes down to the thought of really, truly leading by example. If you're able to lead by example and put yourself in a position to say, the reasons that we're doing this is because when we all get together, this is what we experience. Or let's look at like the VFW now. I mean, it used to be that the VFW, when I started to get involved with that after the first Gulf War, there was a thought that this may be a dying organization. You know, you had the World War Is and the World War IIs and the Vietnams and the Koreas, and now all of a sudden you didn't have those veterans that were there that were able to, you know, have service for the veterans of foreign wars. But now as we move into this, you know, the veterans from the Afghanistan War and the Iraq War, you're still having trouble bringing these folks into the fold of how to grow these organizations. I mean, where is that, how do we cultivate that virtue of service? That's why I go back to you, Chad, and say, I think we have to lead by example. I think we have to show the benefits of service. I think we have to outline what service means. And I think we have to be able to create that, I don't know, I mean, maybe a cheerleading type of mantra that really kind of brings people into the fold. But I don't think it's just by chance. I think us as leaders, we've got to go out and set that pile.
I agree with that 100%. Sebastian Junger wrote a great book recently called Tribe, in which he looks at how the experience of veterans can sort of help all of us see the benefits and the power of feeling really connected to another group of people. And he points out that in some respects in our society, we don't have adversity that pulls us together. We have created adversity that pushes us apart. And he points to examples of having a common foe or a common threat or a common challenge. And in those conditions of really serious, even crisis, people pull together in ways that we don't tend to otherwise. And I think that as leaders, we don't want to go out and create crises, but we can create by our actions. As you say, leading by example, we can create conditions where people pull together for the common good. And we have to be the first people to do it. And if we're serious about asking other people to make time, we got to be the first to make time. As you know, one of the most important ways to lead by example is to look at how you spend resources when the chips are down. So if you're committed to service, those can't be the initiatives that go away when the budget's tight. We have to make it a priority even when it's hard.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I think that's really important because as we now start to look at cutting things back, we don't want to take away the things that are really going to give us the tools for us to be successful leaders. So, Chad, it's been quite a few months since we've been here. This is the 6th month. You and I started this discussion of the virtues of ethical leadership in January. So maybe, give us kind of an overview and put a bow on this for everyone. Maybe the people that have been following us from the beginning, maybe those that need to go back and pick up a couple of those episodes. But go ahead and give us the Reader's Digest version of the virtues of ethical leadership and the framework.
First of all, ethical leaders are people who empower others to make a positive difference in the world. Differences large and small. This isn't Gandhi-sized stuff. This is the person that sits down the hall from you, who's always there to give you a hand when you're stuck. This is the supervisor who knows his or her people really well and understands their goals and looks for opportunities for them to develop and celebrates their successes. The ethical leader is someone who brings out the best in others and empowers others to make a positive difference in the world. To do that, we need some skills and commitments. And drawing on the Greek perspective for character development, we call those skills and commitments virtues, qualities in us that we can cultivate in order to be the person who brings out the best in others. So in order to cultivate those virtues, we need to know what they are, and that's why we've been talking about them for about 6 months. And just for the record, again, we're talking about 5 big master qualities: courage, competence, creativity, clarity, and the master topic of today, service. These are the 5 virtues of ethical leadership. We build those virtues by being aware of them, by guiding our actions in accordance with them, and reflecting on our experiences. When did we do right? When did we do wrong? What can we learn from it? What are we most proud of? What are we least proud of? What would we do differently? And so, virtue development can't be an individual sport. The virtues live in us as individuals, but they develop as we form relationships with others. You had wonderful podcasts with other guests talking about mentorship and some of the other features of leadership. These are all critical capabilities for developing our virtues. And so, if we're serious about getting better as ethical leaders, we're connecting with other people, we're trusting them enough to say, hey, look at me. Help me celebrate my successes, but help me correct my failures and let me do the same for you. And let's get better together. So this framework of personal, individual development becomes a framework for teams and even for organizations, sort of to be engines for cultivating the qualities that make us better as a group. That's the idea of virtue-based leadership in a nutshell. That's how the framework of the virtues of ethical leadership fits into this broader enterprise that your podcast is about. Like, how do I become that leader? What are the ultimate tips and techniques that can make me the leader I would be really proud to be? And so I'm actually very honored to be a part of that extended conversation that you're leading around the nation, to share this toolkit so that it may be valuable to some of your listeners.
I could tell you, man, after the discussions, I mean, there's just so much that you can pick up from all of these things. And I guess a couple things I want to ask you, but first is if people are out there, they want to engage with you, they want to learn a little bit more about the Virtues Framework, how do they get in touch with you and do that?
Well, the best first step would be our website, www.ethinact, ETHINACT. It's a contraction of Ethical Leaders in Action, ethinact.com. And you can call me directly. Our office phone number is 651-646-1512, and that's, of course, in the United States. You can reach me via email through that website, and I would be delighted to engage with any of your listeners at any time.
And I got to tell you, Chad, I've had a great time. Now, I don't know what's next. I mean, this can't be the last visit. It's been 5 visits. You can't tell me you're disappearing now. What are we doing next?
I sure don't want to go away. I want to keep coming back. And you did describe us once as Tom and Jerry, and what good would Tom be without Jerry, right? I have a proposal for what's next. I know that you've got a book coming out, and when that is ready for the world, I would love to come back and interview you.
Oh, how awesome would that be? And actually, you did for my first book, Ultimate Leadership, 10 Rules for Success. You did do an interview. It was very well. You should be getting your Grammy any time now, I think, from that.
Excellent.
And I think that would be another great opportunity. But again, I want you to think about, the bill of ethical leadership. And as you come across a story, or as you come across a procedure, or as you come across a thought that would make for a good, entertaining discussion, shoot me an email. Let's get you back on, because I have to tell you that I think this series of ethical leadership had a lot of resource. It gave a lot of ideas and a lot of plan for how individuals can get from where they are today to get to that next level of being an ethical leader.
Well, thank you. It has been a remarkable pleasure for me, and I'm delighted to know that the pleasure is going to continue. I will give your listeners one taste. I'd love to come back and talk with you about practical ways that leaders can keep alive a sense of purpose, because that really continues to be a challenge for our clients and for the leaders with whom we work. And so we've given a lot of thought to ways that leaders can practically apply that commitment to being purposeful and mission-oriented.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a great show, and I think that's another one that could probably go more than just one 30-minute segment. But I got to tell you, Chad, I want to thank you for joining us again on the Ultimate Leadership Podcast. For everybody out there, I want to thank you for again coming along and allowing us to join you on your professional development journey. And until next time, this is Chris Cebollero, and I look forward to chatting with everyone again real soon.
Thank you for joining us. The Ultimate Leadership Podcast is a production of ChrisCebollero.com. You can interact with us by email at ultimateleadership16@gmail.com. All rights reserved.